Welcome back, everybody. So each day of assembly at 3 p.m. Pacific, there's a lecture from a third-year student in the PSU Art and Social Practice MFA program. It's their third year, so they're just days away from graduating. So exciting. Each person will give an overview of the work they've done during the 3 years in the program. It's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Jarrett for a more in-depth introduction to the upcoming lecture. Lisa is the Associate Professor of Community and Context Arts at Portland State University's School of Art and Design and co-founder and co-director of KS MoCA and the Harriet Tubman Middle School Center for Expanded Curatorial Practice in Northeast Portland.
Thank you so much, Karin. Hi, everybody. It is my honor and my pleasure to be introducing our 2021 MFA candidates in Art and Social Practice at Portland State University. This afternoon, Thursday, June 10th, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, it is my delight to introduce to you Emma Duehr Mitchell. Emma Duehr Mitchell is an artist, educator, and curator living and working in Portland, Oregon. Her work explores the intersection of public and private spaces, personal and collective value, and subjects of the everyday through storytelling. Emma is the founder and curator of the People's Plant Museum, which celebrates the relationships between plants and people through a living collection and digital archive. She's also the organizer of Talking Tushies, a project that embroiders sexual violence statistics on cloth patches and invites survivors around the world to share their experiences through writing on the project website. Her Homes for Homes project creates memorial drawings of residential buildings and archives their value through interviews with past residents. She teaches at Portland State University and is an artist mentor at Dr. MLK Jr. School via the King School Museum of Contemporary Art, or KS MoCA. As a third-year student in the Art and Social Practice program at Portland State University, Emma's graduate lecture will encompass the projects and influences that were the focus throughout her graduate school experience here at PSU. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you so much, Karin. I am really grateful for your wonderful introduction and the just time we've been able to spend together in this experience also. So I appreciate it. And I am grateful to see all of you here as well. Thank you so much for joining and choosing to spend the next 50 minutes of your time learning more about me and my work. As Lisa stated, my name is Emma Duehr Mitchell, and I'm an artist, educator, and curator living and working in Portland, Oregon. And I'm also from Dubuque, Iowa. Today, I'm presenting my graduate lecture, or in another way of describing, it's a lecture that will encompass everything I've done within my time in the studio and social practice programs at Portland State University. I'll provide an in-depth look at my graduate project, the People's Plant Museum, and a series of other projects such as Talking Tushies, the Home Inventory, Homes for Homes, and more. I hope to give you a further insight into the work that I do and the experiences and influences that have shaped why I do what I do. And I will hope to leave room at the end of my presentation for questions and a conversation. So if you have any questions at any time, I would love to see them pop up in the chat, and then we can answer them at the end of the time. And then that goes for people on YouTube as well. You can still share your any comments or questions that you may have. So for all of you faces that I can see right now, thank you. And for everybody joining on YouTube, thank you for being here. I am going to share my screen now and get into the full lecture. And take a big old drink of water first. All right, so welcome. I want to start by introducing four main aspects of the work, four main aspects that I focus on within my work. A main question that I'm asking is what is valuable and who defines what is valuable? And a way of exploring this question is through personal and collective storytelling. My practice explores the intersection of public and private spaces and subjects. And my projects frequently result in documentation of personal histories. So I want to start by sharing a few personal experiences that have impacted my practice. So I'm originally from Dubuque, Iowa, which is a small Midwest town on the Mississippi River, right on the border of Illinois and Wisconsin. And I moved to Portland in 2017 with my partner, Lucas. I stayed in this tiny little town where all of my family, most of all my family still remains living there. For my undergraduate school experience at Clark University, where I studied studio arts in painting and sculpture with a minor in art history. And this experience of being really involved in a studio practice background has really shaped a lot of my social practice practice. And I actually started my graduate school experience in the studio practice program, and I transferred into the social practice program at the end of my first year. And we'll talk more about how this experience has shaped my work. So here's where I originated. While I was in my undergrad, I was really curious to the questions of what do materials represent? So thinking about my undergrad thesis show, I was interested in discussing humans as invasive species through materials that are invasive or destructive to the environment. So thinking about the lumber industry and other industrialized practices. So really thinking about what does the material of wood and metal involve, and how can I use that pre-existing language to talk about something. I'm also really curious in the relationship of just a basic art material. So for example, here is oil painting. So I was really interested in oil painting as a material that was commonly used throughout art history to depict moments of history or to represent moments of history. And I was really interested in the material as being credited or a credible material that is very common throughout art history and is just a respected practice to talk about this history being made. So with this examination of what do materials represent, I started to practice embroidery, and really because I was interested in the history of the needle and thread as a labor practice. So really thinking about the history of the craft of embroidery and weaving and textiles as having a rich history in feminine work. So for example, there has been, when artists were commonly, mostly men, embroidery and needle and thread was one material that set women apart from male artists. And it was something that was commonly found in the house that women were able to work with and to produce their own artwork. So I really think of the history of embroidery as this really empowering material to discuss women's rights and women's history. So I was interested in working with this material while in the middle of a huge historical movement called the Me Too movement. And I have a lot of gratitude to share to Christine Blasley Ford for really introducing a vital time in my art practice. So I really thought about my own private experiences, and a lot of the way that I've have a lot of the ways that I've responded to my personal experiences is through bartending. It's a very social atmosphere, and I'm a very social person. But thinking about my life growing up as a female in the United States and being a bartender for over 10 years, I commonly found myself on a public platform that is a space that I always felt that my body was on view or on a public display. So a various amount of experiences of my own other people within my life, friends and families and other acquaintances, sharing their experiences with sexual violence and sexual harassment really inspired me to finally do something about it. So I started the Talking Tushies project, and this is a slight warning of explicit text that discusses sexual violence. So I started the Talking Tushies project, which are sexual violence awareness patches that are made to be worn on the back pocket of your pants. And the statistics cover over 30 different statistics ranging in demographics and ages and situations. And they're all taken from various resources such as the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and RAIN and other women's resource centers around the world. And when I'm looking at what statistics to choose for this project, I was always really interested in the subjects that were depicting, or the statistics that were sharing situations that were happening in private settings. So discussing domestic violence and violence that was happening in the home, and really wanting to use this platform of my human body, of my female human body in public places to raise awareness of private space violence that's happening every day around the world. So really thinking about the history of the female body depicted throughout art history as a space to educate and raise awareness about the sexual violence around the world. And the patches were made to be worn out in public spaces. And through the project, I was able to create over 500 patches from the inside of my own home and shared with people around 7 different countries. It was absolutely incredible to be able to form relationships and feel connected to people around this subject around the globe. And people, whenever they received their patches, would send some photos, and most of them would be shared on the Instagram. On Instagram. So the Instagram page became this archive of people wearing patches in public spaces, public and private spaces. But something that really took me, that was really interesting for me and a big part of the project was that when people shared their own photos, they would write their own captions about sharing their voices and their experiences, and really creating this archive of a community building around the world through wearing these patches. So Instagram became this really great space for me and others to connect with people around the world. And it started to become a conversation and a community space to be together during this really important moment in history, and ultimately started to create space for people to share their experiences with sexual violence on just my personal website, and then archiving their stories and opening the door for future conversations and community building. Talking Tushies patches, since I was making them a lot from my own home, I was interested in bringing this community conversations and dialogues into in-person gatherings. So I started to work with friends and classmates to work on the patches together. And then I also started to create a system for DIY Talking Tushies patches. So people being able to make their own patches and share their own statistics with the project. And the photo on the right was shared by a librarian in Boston who opened the library up for DIY Talking Tushies patches in a high school to celebrate Sexual Violence Awareness Month. So this really began this exploration of how public and private conversations in spaces kind of come together. And a way of responding to that was I created this closet installation where I took those stories that were shared with the project the true stories that were shared with the project, and I hand stitched them on used undergarments and displayed them in a closet setting. So I really wanted to bring these private stories that were being held in private spaces into a public viewing and public awareness. So, but I was really interested in the idea of closet and being closeted and really wanting to bring it out of that space. So each of the garments were chosen because they're silky, they're inviting, they're soft, and you kind of just want to touch them. And then inviting people to turn each of the pages within this clothes rack and read an ultimate story about sexual violence around the world. This work was highly inspired by Cut Piece by Yoko Ono for being a performance that involved the female human body, discussing how throughout art history, there was a common act of unveiling the female human body. And this was one of the first ones that I connected to for being more of an aggressive unveiling of the human body. And it was very telling and felt very real on how a human body is treated when nude. Another project that was highly influential for this project was Marina Abramovic, Rhythm Zero, in which she invited people to use various amounts of or various objects to do whatever to her body for 6 hours, where she did nothing but stand there and allow anything to happen. And ultimately, this work had a great impact on me because it was really pushing her body to the limits and really thinking about her body as an object that people could do and play and just treat however they wanted. And something that was most influential for me about this project was as soon as the 6 hours were up, or when the 6 hours were going on, people would one person put a gun in her hand and had it held up to her head. They cut all of her clothes off and just really disrespected her full body. And something that really took me was that at the end of the project, when she got off stage, everybody just kind of ran away and they couldn't really face that this objectified woman was now a walking real human being who could actually confront them. So really thinking about all the history of performance and collaborate in connection with the female human body to discuss objectification against women. This was happening around the same time as the Monument Quilt, which is a series of quilts that share people's experiences with sexual violence, and quilting them, they're stitching them together and seeing all the stories come together in one unified public space. And where I'm really hoping to go with this project in the future is to do more in-person conversations and dialogues. Like the Instagram page was a really great resource for connecting people in their own private spaces into a public environment where they can, where people can meet and discuss and gather from the connection of their own private homes. But I'm really wanting to expand further by connecting in person with people. So at the end of this first year of my studio practice experience at Portland State, I was really reflecting on the experience of being able to connect with people around the world from this tiny white studio space that I had on campus at Portland State University. And thinking about how I was starting to feel like this interaction and this engagement and participation I was working with people around the world became a little bit more interesting to me. And I really started to think about the object and the interaction and really wanted to explore the interaction part more. So that's when I transferred into the social practice program. And the rest of the work is in this presentation is kind of discussing where that has gone from that moment forward. So thinking about interaction and distance and being able to connect with people, I really started to think about my experience of moving across the country from my hometown, away from family and friends. And thinking about other ways that I can build and maintain relationships from a distance. And I really started to think about the process of moving away from home. And this is just our vehicle, that everything we brought to Portland with us. And one of the things that we weren't able to bring in our car with us, because we had to get rid of most everything, we just decided to start over. And one of the things that was just a little too big to fit into this packed car was a cutting of my family cactus, a cactus that's been in my family for over 60 years. And it didn't make the cut, so I had to leave it at home. And we'll talk about my connection with plants and this specific plant a little bit more when we start talking about my graduate project. But this was also just the beginning of me discovering my interest in the connection between belonging in a new place and belongings. So what does the object represent? So while moving across the country, I was really trying to figure my life out a little bit, just really in a new place and wanting to discover more about my history, my own private personal history. And I discovered this book that was written by my great grandmother called Me, Myself, and I. And she wrote a series of memories on her typewriter and scanned some photos. And it's the story of her life. I also learned that my husband's family also has a family history book that goes into detail about our family history dating back 5 generations. And and my experience of coming across these 2 family history books was really eye-opening for me by being present within my own life and thinking about my own private history and wanting to create spaces and documentations of my life as it progresses to really honor and celebrate my own history in the process of being made. So one of the projects I started when I moved here was portraits of every house I've ever lived in. I really needed this sense of belonging and my own history in this new place that I was now calling home. So creating memorial drawings of every house I've lived in as an installation on my wall. And ultimately, this experience started the Homes for Homes project, in which I became really interested in the memories and the importance of structures and residential buildings that people once lived in. And this drawing actually was done in like 2016 for a professor of mine, but really dating back to my interests. And I started to do custom house portraits for people and really curious about the memories and sharing what they want to remember about the house with the drawing. And then I archive each of the house portraits on my personal website that they can look back at any time. So I'm still doing custom house portraits if you are interested in engaging with this project. And now I want to share a little story about this house specifically and how it has grown to impact a lot of the work that I've done ever since. So if you see the caption here, this photo was taken in March of 2021 and doesn't really look like anything really to people who don't know who used to live there or what used to be in the yard. And the next slide is a photo taken in 2011. And this yard was filled with handmade grottos by my great-grandmother, Madeline Buell. Here's a photo of her posing with her grottos. So really thinking about from the outside, what do the memories look, or from the outside, you don't really know what memories were built there, and really wanting to preserve those histories. So in this house, my great-grandmother turned her yard of this house into a place to exhibit all of her grotto work. There was over 20 different grotto installations all around the yard, and she created them handmade in her basement. Each of the grottos were filled with like little everyday materials, and just as a little girl, myself and my cousins and my siblings would just play hide and seek and I spy within these grottos, always looking for the fun little everyday materials in here. And just one of my favorite memories. When thinking about the outside of the house and what was once there, I was also thinking about Carl here in the middle, who lived inside the house. So great-grandmother's son, Carl. Carl's house, the inside of this house, was an avid collection of everyday materials. My memory is that there was over 3,000 cars, over 100 trains, over 70 clocks, over 200 clowns, just a avid collector of everyday mundane items. And he lived alone in this 4-bedroom house, and each room was carefully curated and designed to be his own private collection and museum. Some maybe subconsciously. So really, like when you went up the stairs, there was one room dedicated to cars. There was another room dedicated to Disney and Nickelodeon stuff, and another wall just dedicated to clocks. So I really was interested in his house growing up too. And when he passed away in 2011, the house was sold. And everything was sold, including the house was sold, including my grandmother's grottos. So all of a sudden, this part of my family history wasn't technically ours anymore. And I'm so eternally grateful, as well as my family, for the Kohler Foundation for finding my great-grandmother's grottos and choosing to preserve them into their museum. They cleaned them up, they shared, they archived the book that she wrote, and they have full, great photographic documentation of her story and her influences, and they are safe with this foundation. Absolutely wonderful. Thinking about Carl inside and the intention that he put into his house and the collection that he built, most everything that was in his house was sold at a garage sale for like 25 cents. It seemed like it was just a bunch of junk. But looking back in my memory, it's one of the most these are some of the most valuable materials in my life. Some of my family members have little everyday, some little memories of Carl through these objects. And I have one school bus to honor him. But most of all, Carl's memory is through written and spoken memory. And since then, I really started to think about who defines value and how can I preserve and celebrate the types of value and histories that are not commonly exhibited in museums. And really dating back to my initial question of what do objects and materials represent? So in undergrad, thinking in sculpture, I'm thinking about materials, but now I'm started to think about objects as materials and what do they already embody in the stories that they hold. So I started the home inventory project while working with my students at Portland State in teaching introduction to sculpture. And in sculpture, we think about these about everyday materials, and commonly used in a project called assemblage. So how do you use everyday materials to create a sculpture? So not going out and buying anything, it's just what do you have around? So a prompt that I had for my students was to go around their house and think about the materials they already have and what kind of stories and conversations and themes arise when looking and thinking about these objects. And this project was started during the COVID-19 shutdown. So really trying to think about the power of people's homes and what people choose to keep and collect in their homes. And it was a wonderful and continues to be a wonderful archive that I'm growing on my personal website. There's an object here. I'll read a couple, but my grandfather wore the same button-up shirt every day with a different print. When he passed away, my grandmother made pillows out of the shirts and gave them out to each family so that we could all have a part of him with us. So really wanting to create space to have the conversations about how everyday materials or common materials that are maybe just lying around the house and what kind of value they hold and why people choose to hold on to them. And really taking that as a starting point for really valuable conversations. Here's just another one. This is a small compilation of some of my ancestors that I keep on my altar that has a lot of spiritual value to me. And then just thinking about different types of value. So there's sentimental, personal, financial value, and really wanting to create space and projects that are celebrating the variety of types of value. So when my partner and I bought our first home out in East Portland in 2019, I really started to think about this idea of belongings and belonging again. And by leaving all our stuff at home and having this place that we're going to live in for a while, I really started to think about what defines a home. And I started to ask people or go to people's houses. And I always was interested in what do people collect and what kind of stories do they hold and these types of exhibits that are naturally in people's houses. So this is a magnet collection of my grandmother Betty's. And here's another collection of wooden masks collected from around the world. And this is an ongoing project that I'm ask people just where did this collection start? Why do you do that? And then I take some photos and archive them on the website. And then I started to think about what do I collect and what do I choose to put in my home and fill my home with? And my answer is plants. I have collected over 100 plants since I moved to Portland about 4 years ago. And ultimately this examination started the People's Plant Museum, which is my graduate project, and it will be the center of the rest of my presentation today. So for a brief introduction to what People's Plant Museum is, it's a museum that tends to a living collection of plants and maintains a digital archive of interviews with people about their plants and hosts a series of projects and events for public participation. Ultimately, the People's Plant Museum is working to celebrate the relationships people have with plants. And now I just want to take you through why I started this project and really in more detail about what it is. So when I moved to Portland, like I said, didn't have any friends or family here. My partner and I moved here alone. So at this moment of my life, I started to build relationships with the natural world and exploring landscapes I've never seen before, and just really fell in love with the Pacific Northwest. And I really wanted to bring this natural beauty inside my home. And I started to think about maybe ancestrally, why am I interested in this connection? Why do I have this relationship? And I started to think back about my favorite hobbies growing up, where I was helping my mom with her hostas and with her garden. And she always had hostas all around the house. There was front and back, side yard, hostas everywhere. And if you don't know what a hosta is, it's a really strong, durable, perennial flowering plant. And they grow bigger every year. So my mom would have to trim them. And she always tried to find new homes for them. She would give them to friends and family, or just like plant them in elsewhere around the yard. And just has a really special place in my mom's heart and in my own memory. And when I was back home for the first time after leaving, my mom asked me, "Do you want to bring some of my hostas to Oregon with you?" And all of a sudden I realized that there's this way of having something really special and important in my life growing and living with me in my new home. So I did. And this takes me back to this African milk tree from my family cactus that was given to me by my Aunt Mary. And I really wanted to create a space that celebrated this cactus. And as I moved forward and was navigating this new space, I started to make new friends. And a way of, when I went over to people's houses, I would ask them about what kind of stories that their plants hold. And this is a story from a plant from my friend Liz, which is actually cutting from her mom's plant, which originated with her grandmother. I started to collect plants from other people and really made a lot of really great friends along the way. It's a way of sharing a little piece of life and enjoying, and getting to know one another more and making a collaborative effort of growing something together, both the relationship and the plant. So I started really loving plants and I wanted more of them and started to buy them and realized that there was a financial burden maybe to the practice, especially when most of my plants came from friends and people who taught me how to take a small little cutting of something and grow it and grow roots and grow it from seed and really appreciate the process and the history of where the plants originated and really like taking time to grow it ourselves. So this is a photo of just of a plant that is like $200 for a cutting, just as an example of how some plants have become rarefied or held with a financial value. And I was just really interested in honoring plants in the natural world with more of a relational value and personal value. So I started to just devote time to exchanging plants with people and wanting to help people build their own relationships with the natural world without having this financial burden and really making friends and relationships along the way. And then I thought there was this common practice of having this little guide when you buy plants from museums, and it says like how much water it needs or how much sun it needs and some little moments of its history. And I just thought there was nothing really like that for promoting exchanging plants with people. So I started to track them. I started to say who were they from, ask them how much water and sunlight they need, what type of soil, etc. But then also to tell me what type of relationship and story does the plant hold, that I can like honor that and continue the plant's legacy. And I've just always loved doing that. And I started the People's Plant Museum by formalizing this collection of plants that I grew from specific people and places and times within my life into a museum of plants. So really honoring the stories and the histories and the value that people assign to plants and looking at the plants I already had in my house and formalize that into a museum to celebrate its histories. A way of formalizing the plants within my house was to create a website and to formalize a formal collection of plants. And the way that I did this was I collected images and interviewed people about the plants that they've cultivated within their life. And each of the plant stories are archived and preserved on the museum website. And then I'm also kind of like organizing them with custom plant drawings. And then the website became another place to talk about and promote other projects and events that the People's Plant Museum was putting on. And the way that I formalized all the plants within my house already, and then I wanted to expand and continue collecting more plants. So I thought of the ways that museums were operating, and in a really, thinking back to my studio practice background, I thought of this practice called studio visits, where a museum, somebody involved with the museum or a curator will attend an artist studio and ask them about their artwork. And usually the curator is thinking about a specific show or a reason that they want to work with that artist. And they'll ask them about their work, and then they'll commonly select one to exhibit in the show. So I started to do the same thing whenever I went over to people's houses. I would go around and ask them about their plants and ask them for a tour and ultimately tell me the stories about them. And then I select one that I found to be a really meaningful, compelling story that I wanted to share within the museum. And I asked them for a tiny little cutting of it. I don't want to take the plant away from their house. I just want to add a little piece of it to mine. So I grow them from roots and sometimes seeds, and grow another addition for the museum's collection. These home visits are also done virtually, where we can gather everybody who has the same plant and talk about the history of the plants that everybody shares. Also thinking about the ways that museums formalize their collection is through exhibitions. So I started to think about the common themes and the common stories that were within the plant collection. And I decided to separate them by themes. So one of the exhibitions is family plants, unique plant biographies about being grown throughout family generations. And every plant that's in the family plants exhibition lives in a blue pot. And this is where I started to celebrate the African milk tree from my family. So again, this plant has been within my family for over 60 years, and over 12 people within our family tend to their own offspring. And then family from there and friends. This is the Klein cactus, which is actually my partner's side of our family. And the Klein cactus has been within the Klein family for over 100 years, and over 40 people within the Klein family tend to their own offspring of the cactus. So really thinking about how there's a family heirloom, but also a living part of life that is able to expand within family generations. There's also irises from my grandma Johnny, who I never met, and this is my mother, where she dug up my grandma Johnny's irises and have them planted around her yard. Transplants is another exhibition, and every plant in the exhibitions, in the transplant exhibition, are in pink pots. And these are about adjusting after moving to a new environment. So Palmita, with Diana Marcella Cortez and Geronimo Roldan, brought little Palmita from Cali, Colombia, when they moved from Cali to the United States. And they wanted to have a little piece of their home of Cali, Colombia. So they decided to bring a miniature palm tree. And when they brought it here, they had to recreate the environment of Cali very specifically in the pot for it to survive. There's also chamomile seeds, a quote, "This is all a written memory," or verbal memory. I remember thinking how neat it was that my grandmother I never met carried those with her, so she would have that part of Germany with her in this new land. My grandmother knew she would not see her homeland again. This is a story about Mary Klein's great-grandmother bringing chamomile seeds and Mary growing up with them without knowing its full history. There's also rotating plants, which are orange pots. And those are, these stories are about entrusting plants to somebody else. This plant was given to me by my friend Renee, and she gave it to me when she moved to California. She received it from a friend of hers named Tasha when she moved away too. So this plant has this legacy of entrusting it to one of your best friends whenever you're moving on to a new chapter. This Forva Stevenson plant collection is where when master artist Michael Bernard Stevenson Jr. Moved from their hometown on the East Coast to the West Coast and cultivated a series of a large plant collection from specific people and places. And when they moved, they left their collection with their mother, Nancy. And this story is about how things changed. Some plants died. Ultimately, there's a lot of change with the exchange of who was caring for it. And ultimately tells a story about I think about authorship and also about family history. There's also the Henry's Rose Garden, which were donated by the previous owners of our house when we moved here, and they tagged every single one of them, gave us a guide on how to take care of them, and learned that this rose garden was planted in honor of her grandmother. There's Artists with Plants, which is the compilation of unique plants that were donated by artists whose practice has a connection with plants. And this example is the Chinese money plant with Harold Fletcher. And in our interview, we talk about how his background in art and agriculture have this overlap and how the two intertwine. And I'm also interested in your plant stories. So you can visit peoplesplantmuseum.com to share your own plant stories. I also formalized the plants in the collection by adding a certificate and making a custom plant portrait. And I'm highly inspired by Portland Tropical Gardens, which is honoring the stories of where tropical plants came from in tropical environments. I am also influenced by Houseplant Vacation by the Machine Project at the Hammer Museum, in which they invited people to keep their houseplants at the museum for an exhibition. And really thinking about how this museum was able to invite plants, but it wasn't a museum specifically about collecting plants permanently. And I'm also inspired by Edible Estates by Fritz Haag, who was interested in turning front lawns into edible estates in people's everyday houses. And thinking about a way of formalizing history in these plants, I just launched the inaugural set of People's Plant Stories, which are individual publications telling the personal histories of these respective plants. There's an introduction from me, and then there's 6 individual plant stories. The set is now on display at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at PSU, and there's the 6 plants that are featured on pedestals there growing within the museum, and you can also read it there, or you can purchase it at peoplesplantmuseum.com. And then this is the last section of my presentation, and there's a series of projects and events that the People's Plant Museum puts on. One of them is Front Yards Are Public Art, which is derived from my interest in thinking about front yards as curated spaces that are made for people who live there, but also are viewed from the public atmosphere too. So really thinking about the curated exhibitions that people grow in their front yards. And I interview people about their gardens and the intentions they've put into their yard. Portland Public Plants is an interactive map that invites residents of Portland to archive stories and photos of plants that are accessible to the public. And the Plant Journal Archive is an archive of journals, notes, and drawings that are celebrating the different practices that people have with their plants. And then there's People's Plant Exchange that hosts a series of plant exchanges that invites people to exchange plants and their stories without spending any money.
Hey, Emma, you have about 1 minute.
Yep. And thank you, Lisa. And ultimately, these are all the projects that I wanted to share with you today. because I think they really represent the various levels of personal and collective value that I'm interested in through methods of storytelling. And moving forward after graduation, or graduate school, I am very interested in continuing to archive and celebrate personal types of value, and to create platforms that elevate voices, and to create documentations to preserve vital moments in personal histories. I also work with younger children through one-on-one mentorships and teach, and I create projects hoping to create space in the world to celebrate everyday moments, to gather and share stories together. And that concludes my presentation. So thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to the questions you have to share. Hello.
Emma, I have one quick question.
Yes.
Did you say that Carl's last name was Peterson?
Buell.
Okay, I think that I've seen some of this work at the Kohler Center. We'll talk more about that later. Very interesting part of your story. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah. We're here for questions from anybody. I'll have time later, so I don't want to take up that space.
Emma, I have a question regarding, I think the journey that you took us on was really fascinating. Explain to me though, what do having those objects back beyond the plants, having all those objects that you collect that are memories of other people, what significance does that have for you, and why what would the effect be of not having all those objects?
Great question, Nancy. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm really interested in kind of like discovering the answer that people have to that question, because I think that there's this common practice of people collecting things. And me personally, I just really dove into why do I collect plants? But I'm really interested in like working with people and asking them, what do you collect? And maybe why? And like really working with them to like just honor that part of their own history and their story, and trying to answer that question through these projects, I think. So I guess without them, I don't know. I think I personally hold on to objects for a lot of sentimental reasons, and wanting to like hold a piece of like my history and like my family history in my hand that like I can't like go anywhere else. Like it's mine, and I'm able to like know that and be able to grow from that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'll jump in. Emma, that was great. Thank you so much for your presentation. And just as I was thinking throughout, kind of this like narrative of your life and work, like, have you sought, like from my perspective, it kind of seems like you're trying to bring sort of like Midwestern values into contemporary art discourse. And I think it's really interesting. And I'm curious if that's like something that you think about, or if it just sort of happens as like a product of you making your work.
I'm sure a little bit of both, honestly. Thanks, Nolan. But I mean, ultimately, when I first moved here, I learned a lot of lessons about like, you're not in the Midwest anymore, and things like that. So it's been a long like exploration of like learning a new environment. And I think a big part of my work is like feeling home or comfortable wherever I may go, which maybe isn't a big Midwest thing because a lot of people stay. So I think maybe that's a part of just me growing up in the Midwest, is wanting to have a little piece of little Midwest home with me wherever I go. So I think I'm ultimately exploring that with a lot of my work, I think.
Well, what's an example of something you learned here that you're not in the Midwest anymore? I'm curious.
I mean, dating back, I could date it back to like the Talking Tissues project. I'm in a big town. I'm in a, I don't know everybody, just being in a new place and needing to feel secure and safe, and not in a place that I know every nick and cranny of the town and needing to ask more questions and feeling more secure with things. Thanks, Harold. Any other questions at all?
Maybe just a comment. I'll probably come up with a question in here somewhere. One thing I've really appreciated about your graduate project, Emma, is I can sort of understand how the threads of everything you shared with us previous to that really do have a life and a home within it, even though you're choosing to emphasize different things. And I guess, yeah, it is a question. How do you think about those things? Like clearly drawing is a passion of yours. Homes for Homes, I just love that project title. But documenting things through drawing seems incredibly important to you. And it shows up in the People's Plant Museum in ways that you don't emphasize when you talk about the project. But when I look at the documentation and this gorgeous stack, I've kept the note and everything, like the note is part of it for me. I can't help but be really compelled by the tenderness and care of the drawings, or of like the retranslation of a plant through that habit of drawing it. Same thing with the houses. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the things that you have always been interested in have come into this work and how they sit with you now.
Yeah, I think that's always been something I'm like interested in. Again, because my background's in studio art, so big background in painting and drawing, and always has been a passion of mine. So I think I'm like always looking for ways of like bringing that into everything I do. But I think it is a lot about maybe taking something that's only in here and kind of bringing it out and being able to like hold it again. So I guess like to date it back to Nancy, your question about like, why do you hold on to things? Like maybe it's kind of connected to that, like my interest in like written memory or spoken memory only, like wanting to like make something, an object that you can hold. So that's interesting. Thanks for the question. But yeah, I think it might be that, but then also just I really love slowing down and observing something and like spending time with it and getting to know it more. And that's why I think everything's like really detailed, even if I don't want it to be, because I'm just like really observing it and getting to know it on a different level. And like houses specifically capturing like very specific elements that are important to people. Like one thing was a hydrangea plant in the front of one of those houses that I shared. That was like one of the special things about her house. So I really wanted to include that. So you can like add little things too that are special about something and kind of combine a lot of different aspects into like one composition, I guess.
I have a question. Emma, collecting and is such a big part of your work, and you were talking about it in relationship to Nancy's question. And I'm wondering if there is a difference between collecting objects and what that relationship to the thing is, and the relationship or the intention behind collecting plants. Mm-hmm. Like, are those the same? Or are they different? And how, like, have you found anything that difference in that those two different kinds of collections?
Yes, I have. I also just want to be really aware of time. I don't want to just jump into Justin's event. So I'll answer really quickly. And I think it is that there's a relationship always involved, whether it's like with an inanimate object or another living thing. So I guess I'll leave it there because I want to have I don't want to jump into Justin's time. So thank you everybody for coming again, and we'll talk again